So I asked ChatGPT about the Sherman, not any specific variant, just the vehicle in general, and what it told me about it was basically what I was worried about. Instead of simply being explicitly wrong or entirely correct, it ended up granting itself a sort of plausibility. Let's look at what it actually said. So I just simply asked it what the Sherman tank was, and it told me a good bit, and while it was mostly correct, it did reinforce certain myths. If you want to see what it said, you can pause now and read it all, but I'll just be going to the parts that jumped out to me as incorrect, starting with the most egregious ones. It says the Sherman has two great weaknesses, the first being that it was weaker than the German Panther and Tiger, and that the Sherman was vulnerable to fires because of the gasoline engine and ammo stowage. It even says the Sherman tank was nicknamed the Ronson for this. Now, while the first segment is more of a half-truth, the second half is a popular myth and borderline fiction. The Sherman actually had the best survivability of any World War II medium tank for a variety of reasons, and became even more survivable later on in the war when they introduced the wet ammunition stowage. The myth likely originates from interviews with surviving Sherman crew members and analysis between pre- and post-wet ammunition storage, and despite the sort of overcorrection about the way hobby historians view and understand World War II equipment, from things like the Tiger was unstoppable to the Tiger was shit, this idea that Shermans are bad still prevails. The only real problem here with the first part of the weaknesses section is that it ignores the actual German counterpart for the Sherman, which is probably the Panzer IV or to some extent the Panzer III. Now, while it doesn't really deny this comparison, its wording creates a picture of Shermans facing Tigers and Panthers commonly when they seldom faced other tanks at all. So while I made a pretty egregious error, it only did this because it was fed pop history and online forums, but let's push the topic a little and see what we get. Even after bringing up the myth, it chooses to double down instead of double checking, and considering some of this language, my suspicions about where this myth originates feel a lot more justified. Even when I tried to gently nudge it in the correct direction, it continued to perpetuate this idea and then came up with some new bad ones. Then when I finally outright corrected it, did it actually kind of go back and fix itself? Provided some of the wording it used was still odd, like this part where it says early Shermans were prone to fires, but not uniquely so compared to other tanks of the time, which sounds like it was comparing the Sherman to modern armor or something for some reason. It almost sounds like it's trying to correct itself but not really admit to how wrong it was at the same time, even though it still does that. Now, while this seems like a small problem to nitpick at, it represents an overarching issue with AI altogether. Anything from image or video generation to simple blocks of information, AI is able to create just enough correct info that AI-generated content gains plausible deniability. If only as little as, say, 70% of it's right, then that's still a passing grade. Because of this, it is able to reinforce pop myths and misinformation to anyone who might be trying to use it to pick up basic or niche information about whatever. I know it says under the little bar where you type that obviously it isn't always going to be correct, but realistically, is this going to stop a lot of people? Of course not. Especially someone who is already planning to get info from ChatGPT. The internet is already full of slop content, and internet history hobbyists are not immune, and it gets even worse with image generation. World War Wisdom already made a great video going into it a bit and explaining how image generation threatens the public's perception of history. I'll probably put a link somewhere. But I want to discuss how raw information generated by AI might infect even enthusiastic hobbyists. And to do that, let's investigate the catalyst for a lot of history enthusiasts. If you didn't garner a direct interest in history from a World War II grandpa, chances are you either got it from a video game or the History Channel. Being a small child watching the History Channel with its dramatized language while you sat on the living room floor in front of a box TV is, on one hand, wonderful core memories, and on the other hand, practically the root of all evil, to put it dramatically. The History Channel and a lot of similar media that actually use real first-hand accounts and other pieces of primary information still want to, or kind of have to, be entertaining, and very oftenly they end up being entertainment first. And because of this, they are the main thing the average hobbyist consumes, which is one of the many reasons why myths about the Sherman being a death trap became popularized. Yes, this book might be the main core reason for the myth in the first place, but the parroting of certain talking points between hobbyists is how misinformation becomes solidified, cemented in many people's understanding of history, especially if they heard it from a young age. Even when there was a correction on this perception of World War II tanks, it was an overcorrection from Sherman death traps to repetitive and lazy transmission jokes, mostly at the expense of the Tiger. The T-34 honestly could not be luckier. And then this person gets a little bit older and we have forums like Reddit. More years later, ChatGPT. And now ChatGPT is being drip-fed information from people who are at the very end of this chain. People who absorbed popular history myths as children and probably got older and swapped them out for new popular myths as adults. Provided ChatGPT is trained on actual material and reliable sources, you can really feel it when you ask it relatively basic information about something like the Sherman. And this is because our understanding of history is constantly changing, and despite some of this information being closer to World War II, couldn't be further from it. Like, look at these two books and when they were released. Provided one is still much newer than the other, Death Traps is still closer to release of Air War than it is to today. And both of these contain strange inaccuracies about the topics they touch on in interesting ways, really, but Death Traps is built on misconceptions in this, and Air War similarly has some anecdotes that should be taken with a grain of salt, especially whenever kill counts come into play. This isn't necessarily always the fault of the authors. Countries offer more and more access to World War II records as time passes, and information that is available now likely wasn't then, especially anything hyper-specific. Now, I have to be careful when comparing certain books because they often vary wildly in terms of purpose and how they convey information, so I'm only talking in terms of how accurate the information itself is within these books. But anyways, Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, is itself not a very good source. Or at least that might have been true 10 years ago. These days, it's not so bad. Some articles are quite good, especially if it isn't too political, too topical, or too niche. Especially in comparison to these dusty old books people used to rely on, Wikipedia dwarfs them in terms of everything besides entertainment value. But if we saw Death Traps as a starting point and Wikipedia as a step forward, or at least Wikipedia today as a step forward, then ChatGPT is certainly a step backwards. After using it to research the Sherman, it was like reading a Wikipedia article if the article was written over 10 years ago. I mean, imagine opening a Wikipedia article and without reading past the first paragraph, you can spot not even mild wording issues, but explicit myths. I'm not a historian or even a very good hobby historian, but even I could pick out the inaccuracies in one read through. If you want to learn something or check info you're not sure about, I implore you to at least use Wikipedia and press Ctrl+F to find what you want faster. But if for some reason you can't help yourself, at least ask ChatGPT for a source when you do ask it questions. Then also actually read that source. You might want to learn something, but you'll be worse than ignorant if you're wrong, and even worse if you spread your misinfo online to other people who might not know better. Now, with all this being said, I think it's important to remember that AI isn't inherently evil, but it can be easily misused in every aspect it can be used, especially image generation, but that's an insane can of worms I'm not equipped to open. I just feel like AI use is simultaneously so stigmatized and common that it's very likely this happens more often than is let on, and instead of affecting the heads of passersby looking at generated images, it infects you. Honestly, Google AI summary is probably a greater offender of this, and it's also probably the most behind part of AI technology. But anyways, I'm Boingo, and do your best to avoid deteriorating information feedback loops while you're out there. Alright, later.